All right. So I started a YouTube series very long time ago. It was probably 2018. So I was looking at Bobby Fischer's games in this a tournament in Sweden, the Interzonal tournament in 1962. So now I have a little bit of time because I have a vacation, and I'm gonna try to do a couple of more rounds. So this is gonna be round 4. So I'm just gonna pick up where I stopped like 4 years ago. Fischer played in the first round, it was a draw, and the second round was also a draw, and then the third round he managed to win a game. So now he's actually on 2 out of 3 games before the start of round 4, where he was playing against Lajos Portisch. So Fischer is playing the white pieces and he had to play against the Caro opening against Portisch. So a couple of years earlier he played the candidates tournament in 1959 in former Yugoslavia. So he played 7 games with the white pieces against the Caro and he scored only 3 wins, or 3 points out of 7. So in 1962 he already switched to some other lines because he basically had some problems against the Caro. He experimented with the classical variation against the Caro, also the Panov, and the exchange line with e takes d5 followed by bishop d3. I think he won a really nice game against Petrosian at some point in that line. So we're gonna start and have a look, because in this game he still used the 4 knights setup against the Caro. So let's see. e4 c6, knight c3 d5, knight f3. I've seen, I don't think this line is very popular these days. I think I've seen maybe Ian Nepomniachtchi experimenting with this line, but I wouldn't say that it's very popular. So these days most strong players are playing the advanced variation against the Caro, which has the best reputation, I think. Let's see. In this game, however, Portisch took on e4. So I believe in 1959 the ex-Soviet players, they all chose the Caro against, or a lot of them played this against Fischer, probably some kind of like a preparation they did against Fischer's especially, and they choose this line with bishop g4 in 1959. But in this game Portisch plays d takes e4. So we have 1 viewer on Twitch. If there's any question about the game, you're welcome to, I will try to answer the best I can. And then my goal is I'm gonna upload it on YouTube perhaps later today. Okay, knight takes e4, knight to d7. So I think that Fischer in general is famous to play very well in open positions, but Caro, of course, it's a little bit more a closed game, I guess. Bishop c4, knight to f6, challenging this knight on e4, the central knight. I guess that's pretty reasonable. And we got knight to g5 attacking the f7 square. Black played knight to d5. Also very natural is if black tries to play e6, but it could be dangerous. I mean, if you're not really prepared what is going on, then I would be very nervous about alternatives like these kind of sacrifices. You might be able to play I mean, this kind of ideas with rook e1 and everything, but I still don't think that this sacrifice is correct, but knight e5 is probably a more solid choice by Portisch. And this 1962 tournament is basically 10 years before Fischer became world champion. And he was, of course, a very strong player already in 62. But in the candidates 59, he didn't show any spectacular results. And also in this opening, the Caro, he was definitely not making scoring like very positive results. So I guess maybe some players thought that it's a good idea to play, instead of playing the Sicilian against Fischer, to try the Caro. Fischer played d4, and we got h6, trying to get rid of this active knight on g5, and the knight goes back to the center, still very well placed. Knight 7 to b6, hitting the bishop, but I'm not sure this knight is very well placed here, but also black needs to do something about the development of the c8 bishop, I guess. Bishop goes to b3, and then bishop f5. So I guess in this position you could say that White has a very comfortable position. He has more space in the center with this d4 pawn, compared to black's a little bit more laid back, you know, this kind of c6, maybe e6. And then probably in the middle game, black will try to break with c5 or maybe with e5 to get some kind of equality, I guess. Black played bishop f5, it's very natural, and white, so this knight is very well placed, but it's not backed up with a pawn, so white will have to move it, and he gains a tempo by playing knight g3. Bishop h7, so this is a nice square for the bishop, is pretty safe on this square, and it's controlling this diagonal. White decided to castle. There's also an interesting option here that white could have played the move knight h5, which looks a little bit strange, but it targets the g7 pawn, and that means that black cannot easily deploy his bishop maybe to e7 or to d6 because of the pressure against g7. And if black would respond to play g6, you would just go back to g3, and black could deploy the bishop on g7, but now the bishop on h7 is kind of blocked, buried alive on h7, so it would be problematic for black, I think, this move knight h5. It looks a little bit strange, but very interesting idea, and it could have been played here. And also after e6 you could definitely play knight h5, stopping bishop e7, stopping bishop d6, and posing some problems for black how to actually develop. White instead decided to play knight e5, and black played knight to d7. Very natural move because the knight on b6 is not very well placed, I think. It's kind of a redundant situation with both the knights want to occupy d5. So by playing knight to d7, he tries to trade this less active piece against perhaps one of the best pieces in white's setup here, the knight on e5. White plays c4. Also in situations where you have less space, like black only has pawns on the third row, usually in situations with less space it's a good idea to try to trade pieces, so knight d7 is very thematic, I would say. White played c4, knight goes to f6, So there is a theme called the Pillsbury Knight, where you have a knight on e5 and you try to back it up with f4, usually resulting from d4 openings. So f4, I would say, definitely is interesting, and whenever black would decide to take on e5, you could take with the f pawn, opening up an attack to f7 on the half open file. That would be an interesting idea, but I think Fischer already prepared this idea with bishop f4 when he decides to play c4 to be able to take control of the f4 square. So I guess it's kind of natural to play bishop f4 here. Black continues taking the dominant knight on e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. And we got bishop d6 attacking the bishop on e5, and then queen e2. Short castle. I think the most natural move to play here would probably be to take the bishop on e5, I guess, reducing the material further, and then not too much pieces left for white to be able to build an attack, I think. So that would have been the best shot, probably, just to take on e5. But Portisch decided to just castle here. So both players have completed development, and white has more space, but still black has a very solid position. This bishop is just waiting maybe to trade, so trade against this bishop perhaps. But it looks very solid for black, I would say. And evaluation here could be interesting to check. Just a slight advantage for white. It's pending between 0.0 and then plus 0.3, so very equal position. So let's see here what happened. Rook to d1, putting the rook on the central file. That looks like a normal move. Queen to e7, and Fischer decided to take on d6 and follow up with f4. So you would really like this knight to probably to be on e5 in this position, which is not very easy to accomplish. So we'll see how the game continues here. Black decided to play c5. I think c5 is of course what black wants to do, as I mentioned earlier. But also when you play c5, you really dramatically changes the position. So I would say it's a critical decision when to time this kind of move to play c5. And I do think that you could activate one of the rooks and really activate everything before you change the character of the position with the c5. So, I mean, rook to d8, or perhaps queen to b4, and then rook to d8, or maybe this rook, queen b4, something like this. And then you're probably set up. Maybe this rook is supposed to go to c5, like queen b4, rook fd8, maybe this rook here. And then you could try to play c5, I guess, because it's not that clear how white is gonna improve the white position, because white has done all the necessary moves basically. So now it's black's decision when to time this c5, and I think c5 here was a little bit too fast, I guess. Maybe one or two moves too fast. Queen e5. So yeah, that's a very nice move, because you are targeting the c5 square, you're targeting the queen, and also if black takes on e5, which I think he has to do, then you get the d7 square, because you're gonna attack the knight on f6 and get this square. So queen e5 is quite an important move here to really put some pressure on black. D takes e5. Very unpleasant move, this queen e5 by white. So black had to trade the queens. And it looks like white is going to establish some long-term pressure here. We have knight to e4, rook to d7. Very nice to get this move in. And black continues to play very strong defensive moves, which could be difficult sometimes. Cat, you can take it in the bedroom, maybe, the call. So knight takes g3, h takes g3, bishop e4. Very nice move, activating the bishop, protecting b7, and also preparing this bishop c6 to get control over d7. If black gets to play bishop c6, rook c7, then already he cannot get the next rook into d7 because of this bishop. So bishop c6 is a positional threat here, I would say. And Fischer plays a very nice positional move, bishop a4, totally taking away this idea with bishop c6. So rook to d8, rook to d1, rook takes. So white managed to keep a small initiative all the way to the endgame. He's only controlling the open d file. That's the only advantage he has here, basically. So we'll see if he manages to do something with it. Black decided to play g5, and there are some other ideas that could be possible. I think black is trying to get some active play here in the endgame. He doesn't just want to stay passive, but there might be options to this g file, like possibly playing a6, rook to b8, and maybe b5. Because if white, I mean, it looks a little bit slow to play a6, rook b8, and this idea with b5, but if white would try to play rook c7 at some point, the bishop is still protecting this b7 square, so black could basically sacrifice the c5 and just go back with the rook and then try to infiltrate and also attack g2, attack b2. So at any point, if white would try to take this pawn, black would get a lot of counterplay with the rook d8. Oh, sorry. Anyways, Portisch decided to play g5 here, which is maybe a small mistake. I think a6 would have been better. Bishop to d1. Maybe he's trying to trade this with bishop f3, get rid of this bishop, and there wouldn't be any risks in white's position. I mean, all that white would do afterwards would be play king f2, king e2, and then this rook is basically can hunt down these pawns on the queen side. So bishop d1 looks good. Bishop c6 hitting the rook. White plays rook to d6. Let's see, rook to c8, king f2, king f8, bishop f3, bishop takes. I guess white could have taken with the king here, but he decided to take with the pawn. G takes f, g takes f. So if we go back to this transition in the game where the bishop disappears, so now it's a pure rook endgame, like a one rook each and the kings and some pawns. So in these kinds of endgames, I would say the most important principle is probably to have active pieces, an active king, active rook, and also trying to control the opponent's activity to make sure he doesn't get I mean, in this kind of endgames, if you got the rook on the 7th and maybe the opponent's king on h8 or something, then it's very difficult for the opponent to improve the king. So this kind of tricks are quite useful in this endgames. It's all about activity. Also maybe to making some decisions who is going to win the pure pawn endgame. That's quite an important observation in this kind of position. And Zugzwang can be an issue, but material as well if you can win a pawn. But that would probably be the lowest priority in this kind of position. The highest priority is piece activity, I would say, in this endgame. G takes F, G takes F, King E7. So white decides to play a very active move, F5. And he's opening up an attack on this H6 pawn, and also black it's not easy for black to use the D file because white can always play King E2 to stop these entry squares. But black decides to take on F5. We have rook takes H6. So we have kind of an early endgame here. We played 34 moves and it's already an endgame. Black plays rook to D8, trying to make use of the open D file. And we got King E2, rook to G8. So the players are going back and forth, both players are trying to go for activity. And Fischer is just playing very patiently. He goes back to F2 to make sure that the rook doesn't get in. The rook goes back to D8, King E3. And here is quite an important decision by black to play rook D1. It looks natural, but I think it's a mistake. A better idea would probably be to play rook to D4, targeting the C4 pawn. And if white continues with B3, you could give a check here on F4. And the idea of playing like this is to make sure that this king doesn't become active, because in the game after rook D1, then white can always use this F4 square. Like I mentioned before, activity in this kind of rook endgames is not only the rooks, but it's also the position of the kings. So by playing rook D4, you would make sure that this white king's activity is kind of limited. But rook D1 was played. Fischer plays B3, rook to E1 check, targeting this F5 pawn. So black's rook is definitely active, but if you look at the kings, it's definitely white's king who is more active than black's. King takes F5. F4, rook E2, preventing white from getting over to the D5 square, targeting this pawn. White is protecting the B3 pawn and probably will try to get activity later at some point to get a counter-attack. Rook to D3, rook B3, rook E3. Maybe this is like building a bridge to get over to this square. If white would play King E6, then you get F5 and then you still get to the D5 square. So rook B2, keeping an eye on this pawn, making sure that black has, in this position, black has the more active rook, since black is attacking and white is defending. E6 takes on F7, and now white's king becomes very active here. Rook D1, preventing the king from entering the D file. Rook C3 looks a little bit strange. B6, F5. Trying to pressure black's king to maybe get to the 8th rank. b5. Yeah, now this rook is really making sure that black's king is super defensive. So in this position, I think it's already a large advantage because it's an active king, active rook situation. So this looks very difficult. I think it's probably a winning advantage for white at this point. Rook to d4, targeting the c4 pawn. King e6. Rook check. King d5. Yeah. So maybe you could trade on f7. I'm not sure. Maybe it's not enough, but let's see what happens if you trade. I'm just gonna check because this is a table base. It's actually a draw here, I guess, according to the table base. But rook b6, not giving up some advantage. Yeah, this should be an easy win. Rook a8. So how do you get the win here? Let's see, king f6. Yeah, okay, so now you can just move in with the king, so I guess black is probably out of moves because he can't move the rook here. And wherever you move the king, you're going to allow white to play king d6, and then it's an easy win. So yeah, so this was round 4, Fischer versus Portisch, Interzonal tournament 1962 in Stockholm. And Fischer had 2 out of 3, so with this win he's got 3 out of 4. So yeah, he's definitely moving up, and one of the very good position perhaps to qualify from this point. So interesting to see Fischer playing against the Caro. He has already switched to some other lines, playing the classical, playing the Panov, playing the exchange Caro with e takes d5 and bishop d3, and then these 2 knights. This was probably one of the last games that he actually used it, even if he won. So he basically abandoned this kind of line after 1959. So thank you very much. If you're interested in coaching, I got the website pawnstructures.com. There's a little bit more information about coaching. And I'm doing coaching on Sundays mainly, and I could also do on Saturdays. So, and I also do some simuls on Lichess that you can look out for. All right, thank you very much. That's going to be it for today, and I'll be back to look at round 5. Thank you very much to Tricks for watching the stream. Do you have any questions about the game? It's kind of a short stream, it's like half an hour, but it's a pretty good format to upload on YouTube, I think. All right, thank you very much.